My name is Robert Spillar, and I'm Senior Vice President at STV in charge of smart cities. And I'm joined today by three fine panelists, Chase Klingensmith from the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure at the City of Pittsburgh, Christine Weydig on the end there with the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, and Seth Wainer with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And so I'm going to let each of these folks identify themselves and just in a few quick sentences, tell why you're excited about automation in transportation. We've talked a lot about electric vehicles and started to talk about automation, but now let's talk to mass transit and automation in mass transit. So Chase, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm really excited about some of the opportunities that aren't immediately apparent with autonomous technology, whether it's things like operations of like bus stops. If you could perhaps have autonomous technology, you would be able to do things like have charging be a lot more efficient. If you have something like inductive charging, you could theoretically have vehicles pulled in a lot tighter and more efficiently than if you had a human operator who had to exit the vehicle. But yeah, that's sort of like my area, sort of the unrealized potential.
Great. Seth, why don't you talk about why you're excited about transit and automation?
I'm Seth Wainer with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey.
I think if you talk directly into it, and you should have a green light.
I'll do my best. Okay, so hi, I'm Seth Wainer. I'm with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. I saw a thumbs up in the back. That's terrific. I focus on innovation programs for the port. I'm most excited about autonomous technology because if you close your eyes and you go back about 100 years, the New York City subway system, the greatest mass transit thing ever built in the history of America, was profitable, right? Even the path system that we run today we run, this is public obviously, it costs us $400 million to operate, it brings in $200 million. It was the Hudson and Manhattan tubes, that was profitable because the technology we were using was profitable. It was a profitable technology. It was rail. There was a lot of rail being built in America. There was good supply chains. But here we are 100 years later, and we're trying very hard, everyone in this room, to maintain a very, very, very old technology in a non-profitable environment. And we're coming up with a lot of answers and a lot of fixes. But at some point, maybe us in this room, if we embrace this new technology that's coming out now in a public transit context, we can extend public transit through and through in a profitable manner. So,
great. And Christine, tell us a little bit about what you do and why transit and automation is important to talk about in the same sentence.
Yes. Thank you. So I'm Christine Weydig. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. We are a research-based advocacy organization. It's a coalition of private and public sector leaders. So we exist really to unlock innovation that the private sector has developed and realize transportation systems for people and goods that are more sustainable, accessible, flexible, and efficient. So when it comes, and working on people and goods movement means that we look at autonomy both for freight and for humans, and I know that we're here to talk about public transit today. But what really excites me and my organization about autonomy is that's the future. Those are the mobility systems that will better connect people and jobs, so enhance economic opportunity and access and equity via greater connectivity. It will also be more sustainable. So we spend a lot of time, even in prior panels, talking about electrification of transportation, which is critical for greenhouse gas reduction. But we really need to take a systems-wide approach and look at the future as connected, autonomous, shared, and electric. And I can't emphasize the shared enough. Otherwise, we have that dystopian vision of autonomous vehicles circling the block, waiting for owners and having more vehicles on the road, not less. And really leaning into that shared aspect means looking at public transportation differently. So it might not be mass transit the way we're used to it. It could be somewhat smaller, more point-to-point, first mile, last mile, but also a lot more dynamic and flexible in meeting the needs of riders everywhere.
You know, I think everyone here sort of started some of the topics and some of the questions I want to get into. I want to back up a second, though, and ask the question, well, why do we need to automate transit in the first place? And each of you have touched a little bit, but I really do want to explore that. You know, I know it's the new technology. I know it's the way of the future. But why are we trying to automate transit? When we talk about the transit we're talking about, obviously we're talking about on-street buses and vehicles. You know, are we just displacing the driver? Are we just doing away with jobs that are out there in the marketplace? Why should we be automating transit in the first place? So, Christine, why don't you start us?
Sure. So I know my fellow panelists are far more expert in this area than I am, since our scope is wide. But what I think is getting to be more commonly accepted research and thinking is that autonomous vehicles will be safer ultimately than human drivers, but also we can reduce congestion and improve throughput because that connected aspect of the vehicles is really important. And even with, you know, right now people think autonomous vehicles and it's fully driverless vehicles, but obviously there are different levels of autonomy, and there are certain autonomous vehicle systems and measures that are available in vehicles today that can enhance safety, but they can also, with the connectedness, help ultimately with vehicles being able to travel closer together, reduce accidents and congestion in that way. And that's where you see a lot of the environmental improvements. But what my organization focuses on is there's still a lot of impediments to unlocking some of those benefits. And it really has to do with the way we look at vehicles and what constitutes a vehicle and what features a vehicle needs to pass sort of safety standards and so on and so forth. So really, what we're at sort of a point in the road where we need to look at some of the regulatory frameworks surrounding how vehicles are deployed and accepted, and really reimagine what that future looks like so we can get this.
Yeah, I think, Christine, you're on point. I think a lot of us, when we think about automation, we think about the moonshot, right? The bus or the vehicle without a driver in it. And we forget about all the advancements we've made in the safety and the efficiencies like you talked about, Chase. Why don't you talk about that a little bit with regards to stops and stuff, about how automation can help us today, even if a driver's in the front seat, right?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, you have a little bit more information present with that. And additionally, another thing that I find really, well, sort of building off of Christine's point, one thing that I was thinking the entire time is that people focus on this sort of level 5 sort of scenario where the vehicle drives itself. But we're really at level 2 with a lot of things where you have some safety interventions, like ADAS is one that always comes to mind. And I recently—
Why don't you help those out here with the acronym? What does that spell out?
Sorry, I speak acronym, but it is the Automated Driving Assistance System.
I think that's close enough.
But I recently got a Chevy Bolt EUV 2023, and it is amazing how many safety features there are. Like, if a car comes like by my side in a way where I might pull back and possibly hit it, I get a warning. And I think there's a lot of value in that. That really is one thing that I think gets ignored in this topic of, like, you know, to focus on the end thing. But like level 2 is here, and there's a lot of integration that we can have, even with like vehicles that aren't just necessarily transit vehicles. GM has made a lot of investments in this. Other OEMs are starting to make investments, and so you can see some of the benefits that might come from that sort of trickling down to the personal vehicle market as well.
Right, and with the transit vehicle, even though we have trained drivers for the foreseeable future, those extra features can really help them do their job much safer where we have more people on the bus.
Oh, additional. Oh, yeah. Right. Completely. And additionally, if you look at what bus drivers actually do, autonomous vehicles kind of help us realize that they're not just driving vehicles. They're also kind of guides to the city. I know that when I came in, I actually got some information from my bus driver that helped me get to my next stop in my hotel. We don't want to ignore the value that people have. Additionally, like, they're kind of security guards at times. Like, if somebody gets assaulted on a bus, who steps in? The bus driver. So yeah, I think that autonomous vehicles can kind of help you realize the value that is already there while also making things more efficient.
Great. Seth, the other day when we talked about automating transit, you were pretty bullish on this idea of platooning and how to maximize the throughput of New York's bus lanes, for instance. Can you talk about that a little bit, what your vision for that is?
Yeah, certainly. I wouldn't want to spin it as totally my vision. It's not. It's people before me, and I'm sure folks after me will work on it. I'll talk about that, and then I want to pivot into kind of why it matters. So the exclusive bus lane is from the 1970s. This is a contra-flow lane on Route 3. Contra-flow, so it's going in the westbound lane to get into the Port Authority bus terminal. So, you know, I'm not going to make you raise your hands. When you say Port Authority, everyone says, oh, do you work at the bus terminal, right? So turns out there's airports and bridges and tunnels and other good stuff too. So this contraflow lane of traffic is it's a dedicated lane for buses, and it's the most productive traffic lane in America. So it's moving 600 buses an hour. You know, you could figure maybe 40 to 50 people on a bus, that kind of thing. And one important pilot that our team in traffic engineering put together over the last few years and executed this summer was, is there some type of tech that we can use to retrofit on some of these buses to get those headways just a little bit closer? So 6-second headways is kind of what we're operating on right now, which sounds extremely impressive. If you're standing at the aperture of the bus terminal, you set your stopwatch and and there's another bus coming right in. So if we can shave just 2 seconds off the headway in between the buses, we can increase the capacity of the lane, which would then inform sort of the design of the new terminal and other things as we think about that. But I want to just stress, like, one of the reasons that matters so much is that autonomous vehicles today are trying to maximize profit in a world that we all built. We built, right, roads and highways and parking lots and driveways and free parking and all these things. We designed this whole space. And so then when you put a profit-seeking engine into that space and say, well, how do I make the most money? Certainly the best way to do it is to try to be the next Uber, right? Uber made the most money that we've all seen in this space in our lifetime. And so I think from a public standpoint, we need to think heavily about the infrastructure that AVs could use. Then we need to build that infrastructure and drive the change in that direction, right? If you look at any of the period pieces that are available on Netflix, you look at the streets of New York City and you say, oh gosh, they're covered in dirt, they're multi-use, and everyone's going every which way. If we can reimagine a little bit of what our roadways look like, and there's some good examples of this we can jump into, you can have low-speed, medium-speed AV service that serves as a new version of bus rapid transit. And that matters a great deal because, as Christine said, if you're not going to go into shared mobility, there's only 1.2 people in every car. That's a huge challenge, and it's a third of the problem of the climate crisis. So we can go after that in this manner.
Very good. Thank you. Christine, you and Seth started to hint towards this, but let's talk about the character of transit in the future, right? We've just all been through the pandemic, and clearly that's changed commuting patterns. Is putting a lot of people in a single vehicle and heading to a distant employment center and reversing that in the evening the right paradigm that we should be thinking about at this point as we start to think about electric autonomous vehicles for transit, and how should we be designing our services, do you think?
So a couple of things that I think are important to keep in mind when we talk about autonomous vehicles is form factor and right sizing, because right now most of us are probably thinking of whatever vehicle we drive and it looks more or less the same, but it kind of drives more on its own, either completely or partially or whatnot. But that really is, when we talk about the future of mobility, we really do need to crack the whole thing open. So when it comes to mini mobility, or we've gotten used to the term micromobility as it relates to, say, bikes or scooters and whatnot, but there also is a whole field of mini mobility where it could be a golf cart size vehicle, or it could be a three-wheeler that's enclosed so you're protected from weather. But all of these are important to think about new form factors, new use cases, because depending on the application and where you live, your needs will be different. So if you're in an urban environment, maybe taking a golf cart to the grocery store makes sense, or at least having it pick you up from the grocery store when you have groceries to carry makes sense, but it's not taking up as much space. It doesn't require all of the infrastructure, or it doesn't lead to as much wear and tear on existing infrastructure than, say, a four-wheeled vehicle or a sedan or whatnot. And so I do think it's really important to keep in mind all of these different potential use cases, and the fact that, again, going back to what defines a vehicle, how does, the national safety standards for some of these things, how do they define a vehicle? We really need to look at the landscape very differently and make space for some of these new form factors. And then sort of building up from there, we also need to look at the enabling infrastructure for some of these autonomous vehicles. So right now, with federal funding between IIJA and IRA, you have a lot of money that will be made available for roadway improvements. And shame on us if we take those tax dollars and fill potholes. We really need to be thinking about the enabling infrastructure for the connected, autonomous, shared, and electric future, and think about, well, what sensing technology needs to be in the roadways, what communications technology, what improved striping and signage, and all of those things need to be a part of it. And again, this is so that, and I know your question, I'm sort of tangentially getting at it, but we're working differently, and our lifestyle has changed, not only post-pandemic, but just in the digital age, and it's time for transportation to catch up to that. And so that's where I think you can enable people that are living in the suburbs and exurbs, whether it's by choice or because they were priced out of living in the city. A lot, what you see as a practical matter is a lot of families that are forced out of the city because of cost of living are displacing a housing cost with a transportation cost. So how is it we can zero in on some of these use cases where AVs, if you really unlock the potential of them, it can be a 40% reduction in cost compared to private vehicle ownership, which is on cost parity with public transit, which, by the way, is subsidized. So that's the other thing we need to look at, is how are we redefining public transportation so that this profit model, what private businesses are looking at, they can make these investments and compete.
Right. I was talking to
Christine and I used to work together, by the way.
Yeah, I thought so. I was talking to a colleague last night that lives outside the city a little ways, and he owns a car and he stores it. He says it's a Weydig car, and I said, how much do you think you spend on that car, storing it and paying insurance? And pretty quickly we came up with $7,000 or $10,000, and that's real money every month. And I asked the simple question: if you had that much more money, could you live the same lifestyle but in the city here and do away with a car? And it was like a light bulb went off for him. It was like, oh wow, I wouldn't have to lose an hour of commute every day, or an hour of time commuting every day if I would give up that vehicle. And so, it's the marketplace has moved to a mobility as a service model. I'm not sure that our policies and, even the way we talk about transit, we think about buses or large vehicles. Christine, you've introduced this idea. We need to think much more small vehicle or vehicle types, even all the way down to micro mobility. When we give people the choice, guess what? They use it. When you give them democratization of mobility opportunities, they're very quick and smart about making their personal profit in terms of how they use it. Let's talk about unanticipated consequences. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, right? And so let's talk about unanticipated consequences with, making automated transportation. We've heard planners say, either this allows us to continue to sprawl outside the city, or it allows us to densify. What are your thoughts on that? Chase, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I would say I commonly get asked what I think the future of autonomous vehicles are, and my answer is that there's no set future. I'd say that depending on how policymakers approach things, we can see things play out way differently. If we take more of an emphasis on the communicative infrastructure that benefits a lot of them, we can see a lot more benefits than we might see if we didn't. So yeah, I know there's like a bunch of different scenarios, but like I don't think the most dystopian one will play out, but I also don't think that the best one is a guarantee without good policy. So yeah, I don't know exactly if there's anything set in stone, but I think that we have a lot of potential to address things.
I think you've hit on something, that we have to continue to evolve our policy to make sure that, you know, as it becomes easier to live further away because of automation, you can sleep one direction and, you know, ride the bus the other way and work or whatever, that it results in the cities that we want, right? Seth, what are your thoughts?
I would say in thinking about the worst case unintended consequences, I would just argue, like, if we do nothing, if we demonstrate no creativity, we change no policies, we'll just have lots of people seeking to create a level 4, level 5 vehicle, which they are. Those vehicles will drive on the roads we currently have, and they will, and then they'll fill them up, and it'll be a tremendous problem. And I think Sam Schwartz hits this really well in his book, With No One at the Wheel, and it's a very real, I think we should all consider that kind of the null hypothesis as you think about, how should I redesign this roadway? What about this curb cut? What about a special lane for bikes and a lane for AV cargo vehicles or small rapid transit vehicles? There was a nice paper Rit Agrawal put out right before he joined the Adams administration about, hey, let's extend every bike lane in New York City 7 feet, keep 1 lane for bikes and 1 lane for, you know, limited profile AVs like a Zoox or a Glideways or something like that. And I just think the null scenario of what's going to happen if we don't demonstrate any creativity is so ridiculously horrible. And then from an equity standpoint, of course, like, people will just own their own vehicle. It'll drive them where they want. As if we didn't go through COVID and all of our mass transit wasn't, you know, ridership wasn't slashed in half. Imagine that going down further. Anyone who can take an AV instead of taking public transit will, because public transit will continue to be worse and worse. And I think that's a tremendously terrible outcome for the social good of the country. So let's figure it out.
Right, and the whole transit model works directly to achieve a more positive vision in that by getting people to share. And there's a lot of benefits that come from sharing, right? I mean, we have built community off of sharing. Christina, we have like 5 more minutes, and I want to move to equity and just talk about how equity. You know, we've heard previous conversations about equity, about how we need to make sure through Justice 40 that we are focusing on communities that have traditionally been forgotten. But, you know, we're talking about new technologies. And so how do we deploy these technologies without falling into the trap of experimenting on those very same communities that have been trampled in the past? How do we, you know, roll out these new technologies and not be experimenting, but truly be benefiting the community?
That's an interesting question. You know, I guess what we should probably focus on first, I mean, I think embedded in that question is some sense that they will first, AVs will first take root in some of these marginalized communities. And I'm not sure I agree with that. In fact, I honestly think AVs will take root most quickly in freight movement, whether it's first and last mile delivery or really platooning of Class 8 trucks as they bring goods around. But that being said, I think you do hit on an important point, which is consumer adoption and trust and all of that. And that's where I go back to looking at some of the impediments to this connected, autonomous, shared, and electric future, which are how these vehicles get certified, how they meet existing safety standards, and how we start building that trust. And I think recognizing that we're not going to full driverless right away is also important to help get people comfortable with the technology and the fact that it's safe. But where I think this gets really interesting is in a lot of these communities, private vehicle ownership is already very low. And so I honestly think they might be more ready to adopt sort of a shared model where they don't need to park the vehicle or maintain the vehicle or have insurance, and they still have that connectivity to jobs, to healthcare, that they don't necessarily have readily available today. And it's clean and it's efficient and it's a cool customer experience. Cruise is already operating in San Francisco and people love it.
Yeah, well put. And you know, a lot of the private industry, I think, has learned, and so that was kind of a softball, hopefully back up to this group. You know, and part of smart cities, I think, is really important to remember that it requires really good public interaction and public engagement. You know, a slogan that's been that I've run into that's just very positive is, you know, nothing about us without us, kind of a concept. And so I think that's important as we roll out EV, whether it be in the private vehicle or the mobility as a service or transit, is that we remember we can't forget the folks that we're serving and that we need to reach out to them. Okay, anyone else want to add one last thing?
I wanted to build off of the whole point about stakeholder engagement. I think is really important. We actually had a shuttle that was proposed, an autonomous vehicle shuttle, when I'd started. And I actually started with a listening tour where I met with people and I was like, okay, you have the floor. I'll interact with you, but at the same time, I want to hear what your interaction with this is, what your perceptions are, and then I'll meet you there. And so by taking that approach, I was able to like get what their actual perception was. And you know, sometimes it's not accurate. But if you have people have this conversation, you can meet them where they're at, correct them, like in a conversational way, not like, you know, oh, you're wrong about this, but like in a way where you are able to like have a dialogue with them. And then from that, you're able to understand what your system really needs. And so with our autonomous vehicle shuttle, I actually shelved it for the time being because I came to the conclusion that we didn't have the digital infrastructure to support what people needed. And so I'm now spending a lot of time working with the city on building that up so that when we do actually have autonomous vehicle shuttles, we can handle them properly.
Great.
I would just add one piece to the puzzle of equity and kind of getting it right. I don't think broadband is a bad analogy. I think it's a pretty good analogy to kind of getting it right. I would just stress how local towns and municipalities have a lot of power in the story. So in the case of Uber, if you're thinking about that, airports that charge a fee for the TNC to pick up and drop off create like a market condition for how they can reinvest the money. Cities and towns, unless they're preempted by the federal government, and I really hope they're not, that goes to the broadband example, have a lot of authority to say, if an autonomous vehicle is in our town, it should be doing A, B, and C. This is where it is allowed to drive. This is where it is not allowed to drive, right? We're seeing that play out in Manhattan in some regard with how congestion pricing will take shape. But I think just generally, it's the powerless mentality that creates these like ludicrous market-driven outcomes that we then think are a foregone conclusion. If you take the opposite approach and you say, actually, it's our town, and if you're going to build anything, you have to run fiber for everyone else in the town also. Verizon might not be happy about it, but they'll have to comply with the law. So it's important that just from a framework perspective, we think about public policy. There's tremendous power in every town in America, again, unless the feds decide otherwise.
Or the state. So with that, I want to thank my speakers here and let you all know that we will be outside in the foyer if you have any questions, and all four of us will be happy to take questions or chat with you then. Yeah.